In May of 2024, this car popped up on Facebook Marketplace and I was so instantly enamored by its beautiful flowing lines and gorgeous paint job that I just had to go and have a look at it. And when I got there, I realised that this car perfectly fit the bill for a new full-bore project car, and therefore I bought it and brought it home with me. This is a 1973 Chrysler Valiant Wagon, the Australian Mopar. Now, the thing about this car is I want to get it back on the road and essentially enjoy it. I'm not going to paint it, I'm not going to make it schmicker, but I do want to put this 245 cubic inch Hemi into it to replace the standard 215 because, quite frankly, it's just worn out, it's clattery, and it runs like a bag of bolts. So the plan is to strip this thing down to check its condition on the inside and go from there. And when I pulled the cylinder head off, I realised that it still had cross-hatching in the bore, and at some stage the engine had actually been rebuilt 10th hour oversize. However, there had been water sitting in the sump, so I decided I'd order a set of big end and main bearings for it and a full gasket set to make sure that this thing is nice and fresh and won't leak oil all over my driveway. What we've got here is a 1973-ish Chrysler Valiant Hemi engine. Now, if you're an American, that definitely doesn't look like a Hemi to you. It probably looks more like a Ford 300 cubic inch inline six. Well, actually, there's a lot of similarities between this engine and that in regards to their architecture. But this is a true blue Australian inline six-cylinder Hemi. Now, these things were put into all of our Chrysler products from 1970 onwards, starting with the VG Valiant. And they're a pretty stout engine. I friggin' love these things. They're such a cool-looking engine, and for their day, they were actually quite advanced. Kind of like the Barra motor of the 1970s. But what are we doing with this bad boy? Well, it's going into my new project car. I've kind of been building this engine, or rebuilding, whatever you want to call it, over the past 2 months. I haven't filmed much of it because I really haven't had much time on my hands, and I've just sort of been doing half an hour on it every afternoon, so it makes it very difficult to film and stitch together. But essentially what we've got, this thing is a 245 inch cubic inch inline six. It's called a Hemi because it's got a somewhat hemispherical combustion chamber, and Chrysler Australia kind of decided to call it a Hemi just to make it sound cooler. But this thing's actually out of a truck, so I'm not sure exactly what type of truck, D100 international type thing, but it is going into, of course, a road car. And it's kind of been rebuilt. I pulled it apart. It came with the vehicle that I am actually putting together. He kind of gave it to me for free, or as sort of like a package deal. I pulled the cylinder head off and the cylinder bores looked immaculate. The pistons looked good. So I kind of left that all inside. Put a set of big end bearings and main bearings through it. Gasket set. Gave it a bit of a water pump, etc, etc. Just a nice freshen up, so when I put it into the vehicle, hopefully it doesn't leak like a sieve, but it is a 1970s engine, so it will probably leak like a sieve. Anyway, we're going to chuck this bad boy into the Falcon, get it down to the workshop where I'm going to be doing the swap, and Bob's your uncle. Well, after having dropped off the Valiant engine at my place of work, I think it's about time I showed you guys what car this is actually going in. Don't mind me, I spilt some water on myself, but here we go. This is the vehicle in which that engine will be going into. That is a VJ Valiant Wagon. It is in fact a Ranger. However, unlike the Ford Ranger, these things aren't a massive pile of crap. This thing I purchased for $6,800. That might sound like a lot of money, but if it was a Kingswood equivalent, it'd probably be like 15 grand. It's actually pretty straight, and it probably, well, it definitely has some bog in it, but I frickin' froth this thing. It looks so good. It is almost ugly. The two-tone paint on the bottom. Look, everything about it I just like. And it's the first time I've ever owned a full-sized Australian vehicle from the 1970s. So this is probably, in my mind, the pinnacle era of Aussie cars. You've got the chrome bumper, about as big as cars got here. And you have, of course, under the bonnet, a Hemi 6. Now, the thing about this particular Hemi 6 is that it is a 215, which is 3.5 litres, still a fairly big inline 6, but they made them 245, 265. This being the baby one, I just can't have it. So that's why the 245 is going in. I did get given the 245 with the vehicle, so, I mean, you'd be silly not to. But check that out. That is just gorgeous. This one has a single barrel manifold on it with the single barrel carter. Now it says made in Australia on top, so that's something that you just do not see anymore. It's funny, the Valiant seems to not really cop as much love as, say, the Falcon or the Kingswoods, and I find that really odd because in a lot of ways these cars were actually a fair bit better. I think there was just some stigma about them, the type of people that bought Valiants back in the day. But look, torsion bar, front end, one of the best inline sixes made in the 70s, probably the best inline six out of the lot. I'll show you the inside. There we go, boys and girls. That is a bench seat front, 3-speed column shift manual transmission, and it just smells like the 1970s in here. Truly incredible. Just the basic POV pack door cards. This is the lowest trim level Valiant you could get. Back seat is in pretty poor condition. The guy gave me a front disc brake conversion for this thing because it actually has drum brakes on all 4 corners. But that's the rear end. It looks like a hearse almost. So this is how you get into the vehicle, into the back. So you wind down the back like that, pop that in, and that thing weighs an absolute ton. Holy doolies. But in the back here we've got lots and lots of room for activities, and that's exactly what a Valiant Wagon is all about. In some models you also had a dicky seat in the back, but this one doesn't have it, which is fine. That seat folds down so you can sleep in the back, and I think one of the sexiest parts of the entire car is this little wing on top here. That is actually to deflect wind down at the rear window to make sure that it doesn't get too much dust build-up. I'll wind that back up. The mechanism, I reckon, is a little bit dicky. Somebody's had to rebuild the pin for that. It's a little bit flogged out. But I reckon if you want a full-sized Australian vehicle from the 1970s, and mind you, other cars like the HQ Holden and the XB Falcon, they go for big bucks when they're in good nick.
The Valiant still represents really good value on the classic car market. Look, it's even bigger than its competitors. It's got a better engine. I think they look, like, my personal opinion is they look friggin' awesome. They look like a Charger wagon. And all this for under 10 grand. Once again, if it was an XB Falcon wagon in similar condition, you'd be looking at 15, 20 grand. Probably not at the moment, the car market's crashed, but look at that bonnet. That bonnet just says speed. Now, the first thing I'm going to do to this thing is drain all the fluids out of it, because of course I don't want to pull this motor out of it and then have to deal with the oil and the coolant. So yeah, we'll get that underway. So what we're trying to do with this thing is get it back on the road, so I can cruise around and go camping in it and all the good stuff. I've already put 4 new tyres on it because the old ones were made in the year 2000. They were actually still made in Australia, which kind of says how old they are. Front shockies were blown out on it, unfortunately, so I put a set of front shockies in it. And of course it is covered in oil. But, look, they look to be pretty easy to work on. I've never actually done this before. But what I really like about this car is that it is actually really clean. Well, fairly rust-free, all things considering. There is a few spots of rust which I will definitely attend to. Stuff like that, which is probably just starting to creep in, but in the long run I want to hit the bottom of this car with like a wire wheel and absolutely just rust-proof the heck out of it. Holy crap, it's such a stonking buoy. Look at how high it is in the front end now that the weight of the engine is taken up. That is funny. Oh. Well, there we go, boys and girls. The 215 Hemi is out of the car. A few things that I've noticed. One is it's absolutely covered in schmutz. The harmonic balancer's on its way out. One thing that I've also noticed about this is that it's got the cubic inches on the back, like cast into the block, whereas the new motor doesn't have any indication as to the size of the engine on it, which is weird. I'm guessing because that's actually an old truck motor and this one's not. Which also verifies the fact that it is a truck engine, and also concerns me in that that might be super low compression. So we might just have to turbo it instead. But I've got to zippity zap this inlet and exhaust manifold off of it, which should be sweet. And Bob's your uncle. Now I've got the sump off of it, so that's actually the sump that came with that engine, the truck sump. So what I find interesting about these is that you can see where the bottom portion of this sump has kind of been grafted onto the two, well, the Hemi sort of architecture bottom. So this is a sump that's got to go back into the car. So that's a 245 sump, and look at the sludge in it. That is insane. So I think that's just been caused by its stop-starts being started up and then like driven around a car park and then parked up again, because it's sort of like a combination of oil and sort of like emulsified water. It turns into like a jelly. So that is disgusting. I reckon if I'd like actually decided to stick with this engine and drive it around, it would have picked up the sump pickup, and I would have ended up with low oil pressure and it would have blown up, which probably wouldn't have mattered too much. But anyways,
as it turns out, trying to fit this engine without the use of an engine crane was a bad idea, because I didn't have any control over the angle of the dangle, and it made the engine difficult to line up with the input shaft for the gearbox. And I think that, in conjunction with the fact that I didn't have a clutch alignment tool because I was reusing the old clutch, meant that getting the engine located up to the gearbox took me about 20 million years. After a lot of hard graft, I was finally able to get to the stage where I can start the first start process, which involves cranking over the engine with no spark plugs in it to be sure we've got oil pressure. After about 20 years of mucking around trying to get this bad boy going, I've finally got it to go. First go, we'll see if it will for us this time. Heck yeah. I'm pretty happy with that. Now, as it turns out, I think my fuel is a little bit stale. It's starting to smell a bit like varnish, and I think my spark plugs were fouled. I was trying to start it in the cab, spraying carby clean into it and trying to get to it quick enough so I could rev it up to get everything to try and bed in by myself, and as it turns out, it's just very difficult to do.
Well, boys and girls, the Valiant is on the road. I've been driving it around for about 2 months now, 2 to 3 months, and I am super stoked to be just finally cruising around in such a cool piece of Australian automotive history. But that said, it hasn't all been smooth sailing. I got it registered, got it on the road, started driving it around, and it immediately broke down on me and went through pretty much all the systems, fuel system, ignition system, trying to find why it was misfiring and popping and farting so badly. It even blew up my rear muffler. It was backfiring so hard. And as it turns out, when I was putting this engine together, I put a set of new points and a condenser in the distributor because, you know, I thought I'd be a good human being and make sure that I'm not going to break down. And as it turns out, the condenser, which is a vital part of the Kettering ignition system, had failed. My new Bosch brand condenser, straight out of the box, faulty. And when I look back on all the trouble I had trying to get this thing started initially and trying to get it to idle nicely and run smooth, it all makes sense because that condenser, I put it in even before I started the motor, and needless to say, I am extremely disappointed. But anyways, other than that, super stoked with the way it handles, the way it runs, the way it drives. It's got awesome power. It's really comfortable. It even goes around corners, which surprises even me. And this begs the question, why weren't these cars more popular than their opposition back in the day? Like the HQ Holden outsold these 4-1. And I think these things are probably a better handling and driving car. But look, that's been allocated to the history books. This is mine now, and I really enjoy it. It just gives me sort of vibes of a 1970s car that sort of escaped the late 1980s without getting crushed by the skin of its teeth. And I love that about it. Like the fact that it's been painted with rattle can, it's got dings and dents in it. It's even been painted with a brush in some areas. That just kind of says to me that somebody in the past enjoyed this or just needed it enough to keep it on the road without spending too much money on it. And I think that is a part of its charm. It has lived a life and it's not pretending to be something that it isn't. And I'm going to keep it that way. I don't want to paint it. I don't want to make it look immaculate, because that's not what this car is about. I'm going to continue to drive this thing around and enjoy it. And if I park it in a car park and somebody opens their door on it, I'm not going to cry into my pillow at night. But in the future, I would maybe like to find a good 265 cubic inch Hemi, maybe put a lumpy cam in it or a hotted up cam, twin barrel carby or something like that, just to give it a bit of spruce, a bit of zest, because this thing is a beautiful engine, but it is a pretty lazy performer. It doesn't like to rev, and I just want to give it a bit more attitude. But that's another project for down the track. But that said, you will see this car in a future episode of Full War. We'll catch you next time.